Oh, kia ora koutou, kia ora. How's everyone tonight? I've got the worst voice for actually getting anyone's attention, so I'm so grateful. Thank you for listening. My name's Mel McKenzie. I'm one of the chaplains here. I'm the ecumenical chaplain. And welcome to Ramsey House and for what should be a really lively and hopefully interesting discussion this evening. Just to start us off, I had one of those moments over the weekend in trying to think about just getting organised for this event, how so much of your thinking when you gather people to listen and have discussion and you're organising is about trying to get you here and managing Facebook and all that promo. And I realised I hadn't really engaged with what we're here to discuss. And I just had one of those moments of reflection really, thinking, I'm here because I've heard people's dreams of how their dreams for life, and a couple of friends lately who've been giving them up because they can't find a house around here. They've been giving up dreams of study or work and shifting elsewhere and looking for other options. And friends who sometimes still use their ovens to heat houses, who are eating into enormous, or just creating enormous debt. So I just thought it would be really nice to start this evening lighting a candle, something we do as chaplains a lot, just to remember those that we know who are in dark times in this housing, this housing position. I heard of a friend just before who texted me to say, I've moved into a house 2 days ago, the landlord will not sign the lease now and I might have to move out. She's got no security. So hard things are happening. People are living in really desperate times. So I light this candle to remember and hold it before God. And I hope that we all have that through our creativeness, through our caring, that there would be change. And I really look forward to hearing people's discussion tonight. So I will light this. I can get it going. Right, so can I welcome Andrew Shepherd, Dr. Andrew Shepherd, and he will introduce our panellists. He is at the Otago Centre for Public Theology, and is it Theology and Public Issues? I just need to read it. Yeah. That's got it. So he's our host for the evening, so I'll hand it over to him.
Great, thank you Mel. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's really great to have a really good turnout. I said to Mel, how many will we get? And she said, somewhere between 10 and 150. So I was like, what happens if we have 150? She said, good question. So this is a really good number. Yeah, so I work for University of Otago in the theology program, but work in particular in the areas of public issues. And earlier in the year, pre-COVID, which seems like a lifetime ago now, we were discussing partnering with the chaplaincy here around running some public issues, around issues that we need to sort of be engaged with. And so part of the subtitle, I guess, is Flourishing Futures, and thinking about what sort of futures we want to live in. It seems to me that we live in a world where we have less and less public conversations with each other. We've lost the art of having civil discourse. Instead, what we do is we shout slogans and platitudes at each other, or we post something on social media and we then like or dislike it. And so we've lost the ability to actually have a conversation with each other and to talk about what sort of futures that we want to live in. And particularly regarding the future thing, I'm interested because also within New Zealand, we become quite adept at sort of foreclosing the conversation in terms of bigger philosophical, theological, religious questions. So historically, if we were to talk to humans and say, what does the future look like? What would you like the future to look like? Inherently, they would end up talking about questions of the narratives that shape their lives, and that would involve those big metaphysical questions about how they came to be and what the purpose of human life was like. And so I guess working for a theology department, those are questions that I find interesting, and I'm curious as to ways in which we can facilitate and bring about flourishing conversations again. So tonight is sort of the first attempt at that, and so I've got 4 panellists who I've asked to come along and be part of the panel tonight. I'm going to introduce them and they're going to come and sit in the, I was going to say in the hot seats, but probably in the cold seats now. So the first is Charles Waldegrave. Charles, could you come and join us, the lecturer? Charles will be known by many of you. Charles is a long-time researcher in social policy and in a number of areas, in housing, in poverty, in refugee issues. He's also an ordained priest down at St. Peter's, and so he comes with a wealth of experience, both pastoral but in particular in the policy area. Charles, really great to have you with us this evening. Kate Day. Kate works as the Advocacy enabler with the Anglican Diocese of Wellington. Come join us, Kate. And her and Charles actually have been running an event on housing for the last few weeks. The last 6 weeks now.
Yes.
Yeah. And had 10, 30 people? How many of you
I
had?
think about 20 something folks
Yeah.
coming along. Yeah.
So engaging with this question on a much deeper level, which has been fantastic. Wayne Kirkland. Wayne is, I know Wayne from 25 years ago when I lived here in Wellington. I used to say Wayne was my used car salesman friend. And now I say that he's become my property developing friend. So Wayne has a long background in both, theological education, community development, but also, interfacing with those commercial realities of making a living selling cars, or in the case now is thinking through questions of property development and social housing. Great to have you. Thank you, Wayne. Danielle, I've just met this evening. We've spent the last few weeks engaging via email. Danielle is a student, or was a student here. Are you at Vic?
Yeah.
Yep. Doing sociology, is taking a year out at the moment. But she's based 2 doors down from here at a place called Berrigan House, which is the Catholic worker house, which provides hospitality to a range of people. So Danielle, thank you, come and join us. How we'll run this evening, I'm very keen, often when you chat up an event you end up with a talking head speaking to you for 40 minutes. And so the idea on these forums is to run more of a public discussion. And so I'm very briefly going to just give a wee introduction in terms of maybe framing the question that we have before us in terms of the idea of a housing crisis, whether we are facing a housing crisis. I think it's pretty incontrovertible now. It took a long time for politicians to get there. And once I've framed it, then essentially I'm going to sit down and just facilitate a conversation between these four around how we might open up this conversation. And in particular here, looking at not breaking it into a binary conversation around good and bad, but rather recognising the complexity of this issue, both in terms of how we've historically, what are the factors that have led to the situation we're in today, but also thinking through how we might respond and recognising that there's complexity there in terms of working at a policy level, right through to practical level, and then into personal responses from those of us in the room as well. Thanks for all coming. We'll kick off very quickly, therefore, around an introduction here and thinking through the idea of housing. I'll get Matt to flick this. Do we have a housing crisis? I was reflecting on this the other day, and 3 years ago in an election, I think we kind of finally got to a point where we had a government who kind of put their head and said, oh yeah, we might have a housing crisis, having held it at bay for a long time. And I think then in the last 3 years it's become very obvious to us as a country of the depth of that crisis. A declining rate of home ownership and a severe shortage of healthy, secure and affordable housing for people who do not own their own homes. Thanks, Matt. This actually, I give credit here to Kate, because actually I had a really full week last week, and I said, Kate, you did some introductory stuff, so a lot of this is actually her work that her and Charles have used. So thinking around the housing spectrum and recognising that at all places on that spectrum we're facing significant issues, whether it be questions of ownership or home ownership, whether it be questions of rental, people engaged in rental housing, or whether it be people simply requiring supported housing or an ability, or what we would call social housing. In all those areas we're facing issues. Thanks, Matt. This gives you an idea of rates of ownership. So just putting things in a historical perspective, New Zealand home ownership was up about 60%, and then in the 1930s during the Depression it dropped, and then by 1951 it went up to about 60%. as New Zealand went through sort of an industrialised period after the Second World War. And it grew and it grew and it grew, and it became an established part of, the Kiwi dream. You're all going to grow up and have a quarter-acre section. And then basically from about 1991 onwards, that has been dropping. And now in 2000, which has actually dropped off the side of the chart, we're back to the same levels of home ownership as we had in 1951. And so sort of we've gone through this long arc, and now we're decreasing at the other side. Thanks, Matt. Key issue around home ownership is the severely unaffordable nature of houses in New Zealand. Thanks, Matt. This is a graph which demonstrates the connection between house prices and income ratios, and so comparing ourselves to other countries in the OECD, both in 1987 or 1992, whenever the earliest data was, through to 2019 in terms of the median market. And you'll see that we don't want to be leading the world on that, but we are leading the world in that, or we're leading the OECD in those areas. Thanks, Matt. 1/3 of households rent in New Zealand now, so over 34% it is. New Zealanders now find themselves in rental accommodation. Thanks, Matt. And recognising again how that impacts across New Zealand in terms of our ethnic or cultural divisions. So here 66% of Pacifica people find themselves in rental accommodation, 56% are Māori, 41% Asian, and European 29%. And so again, recognising here, beginning to think through the ways in which housing is illustrative of broader inequalities within New Zealand society. Thanks, Matt. And as already touched by Mel, thinking through the reality of private rentals, insecurity, often unaffordable, poor quality of rental housing in New Zealand, and difficult for tenants to enforce their rights. This graph shows the increasing, you'll see the blue and the green line there, and the shift and from about September 2015, 2014 onwards, where the average weekly wage for employees drops below the lower quartile rental, which means your wage that's coming in is less and less, but your rental is getting higher and higher. Thanks, Matt. Some statistics here just in the last year around rental increases around New Zealand. And when I looked at that was pretty staggering actually. I looked at that and I thought, my goodness, that's in the space of a year, rental increases. And coming back to Wellington, I've been away for 25 years, and I was talking to friends who were looking to live up in the Kelvin area, and I said, and they said, well, we'd like to, because we're very committed to being near the university, because I'm teaching the university, but we kind of don't really have $1.2 or $1.4 million to buy a house. And I was gobsmacked when they said that. And then having turned up and recognised what rental prices alone in Wellington cost. And again, that's a 38% increase since 2015. Images here, again, thanks to Kate. What does this actually mean? This means stories of real people. This is a story of a 11-month-old child who was admitted 3 times in the space of a few months into care because her parents lived in a swamp house that every time it rained, flooded. And so she was admitted into intensive care with bronchitis. And there was a good end to that story, well, kind of a good end, that they were awarded $6,000 for the landlord's negligence. Thanks, Matt. Final part of the spectrum then is questions around social housing. And thanks, Matt. And we're just recognising here the growing social housing crisis we face as well, in terms of the households who are eligible but still waiting for social housing. And you can see the massive increase in that in the last 5 years as well. Cool. So obviously this impacts huge aspects in terms of our personal well-being, or people in all those areas: health, mental health, education, relationships, community. And that'll be the first question that I'm going to really tackle in terms of asking these guys, what does all this actually look like? As long as we have a house what's the big issue? What's the big issue here around housing and rental? Why is that a problem? Why, as long as people have a house that they can be in, why does questions around whether they own it, why is that problematic? Maybe ask you first, Charles. Why is home ownership such a big issue?
Well, equity is both about income equity and asset equity. So people think of income equity primarily, but if you just take a simple example like COVID, the only way poor people actually get an asset, develop wealth as opposed to income, is through housing in our sort of democracies. So if you take COVID, for example, when that occurred, landlords who were renting out to businesses, many of them came to agreements to reduce rents over that period, but very few landlords who were renting out property did. So the people in the renting were stuck with these rents, even though they might have lost their jobs and they got the wage subsidy, which might have been a drop for them or whatever. Anyone that had just a partial equity in a house, even if it was 5 or 10%, could get a mortgage holiday or could arrange just to pay interest, or there's a whole lot of other possibilities that you've got. And New Zealand was built around, post-war, a home-owning democracy, so that people had an asset. So if you've got a daughter that's having a baby in Australia and you need some money quickly to get over there, you can actually use it. You've got an asset you can borrow, and you've got all sorts of possibilities for emergencies and things. So this is why I think home ownership is very important, and we'll see later on. There's just been complete asset stripping, I believe, of Māori and Pacific people in this country, massive through in the drop of home ownership, and it's not really on the radar of the government adequately at the moment.
I mean, that begs the question, which is, so how do we get here? Why are we in this housing crisis? This obviously hasn't just emerged in the last 5 years. Your suggestion there is that there's a longer legacy in terms of from 1951. Do you want to unpack that, and then maybe someone else can jump in?
Okay, well, I think the neoliberal experiment of the 1990s absolutely fundamentally changed society, and it completely changed housing. What most people aren't aware of is that if you take, for example, from 1960 to 1986, the government, which was largely actually the National Party over this period, but certainly various Labour governments, but both Labour and National, invested, this is using 2017 dollars, 1.5 billion in home ownership products, so that people could, low-income people and low-middle-income people could access home ownership. So this was done through, people could capitalise what was the family benefit. I don't know if everyone knows about there used to be a family benefit that everyone got when you had children. You could capitalise it. So you wouldn't take the money, you'd use it as a deposit on a house. So that got rid of the deposit problem. And then you had what they call state advances loans, or there were Māori affairs loans in these. And for people that were poor, they were actually income related in the way that income related rents are in state houses. So you only paid a proportion of your income towards your housing, and you gained ownership and access to that. So with a lot of those things, you would have seen those figures. You see a peak of growing ownership and stuff, and then suddenly you see in the 90s it starts to go off. So they withdrew the family benefits, so that made it impossible to capitalise. They withdrew the home ownership products. They said the market would actually provide the competition which would lower rents. Well, we know what's happened there. And just leaving it to a market, assuming that people will be kind to one another, is just a really stupid thing to do. It's actually a total political failure, and it's not just It's not just right-wing parties, it's left and right have absolutely failed people. And now, even in state houses, they changed the rules. So the state, when we had home-owning democracies, you had state houses as a safety net because you had a house for life. That was changed in 2014. You now no longer have a house for life. So what happens is you have your kids, and you might be in a state house for 35 years. You've paid the equivalent of a mortgage in your rents. You're then moved out because someone with children is in greater need. And you've got absolutely nothing to show for it. There's no equity, no nothing. You're put into either the private market or some, if you're lucky, you can get some assistant market. But for most people, they're into the private market. And I believe that is absolutely asset stripping poor people. And that's where so much of the problems have come for Māori and Pacific people in particular.
Thanks, Charles. Can I add in there and maybe tell a personal story that might kind of illustrate some of what Charles... In 1986, my wife Jill and I were youth workers. We worked for Youth for Christ. And we moved into we bought our first house in Naenae, which is actually the original state housing suburb of New Zealand, certainly of Wellington anyway. Pretty much all our neighbours were in their 50s and 60s and had raised their families there, had moved in as the first tenants in their homes and been there for decades, and under the scheme were able to buy the house that they rented with the sort of incentives and help that Charles is talking about. It was amazing, really. Naenae and Taita and to a lesser extent Wainui were populated with families like this. Wonderful kind of legacy, really. Even for us, at the back end of that in 1986, we were youth workers, lived on the smell of an oily rag.
So you brought the neighbourhood down.
We brought the neighbourhood down. That's right. Yeah, but we were entitled to capitalise our family benefit, but also to borrow from Housing New Zealand, I think it was, through whoever it was, Kiwi Bank. I can't remember the details, but basically we got our loan for the house through the government, really, as well as a little bit to kind of add into. And I've always kind of felt like, in terms of the home ownership thing, that owning a home is kind of like the best savings scheme you can possibly have. So it's getting people a leg into that. Now, let's move from the personal story to kind of more the macro kind of issue. I think another result, there would be some debate about this, but another result of kind of the neoliberal kind of transformation in the late 80s and early 90s, it kind of sits around the fact that through whatever mechanism, sort of property became tax-wise advantageous to own. I'm talking the family home here, but also in terms of investment, in terms of, and so at least in the last 30, 40 years, some of the issues that we have around our outrageous house prices. Of course, supply and demand drives a lot of this, and there's a lot of very complex kind of issues, that surround this. It's not one particular thing. So there's no simple silver bullet to kind of fix this. But certainly, kind of if you read around this space, you see that our obsession, particularly my generation and above, with buying a rental property and another rental property and another rental property makes perfect tax sense, particularly when, it becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy, I guess, where the acceleration of capital value means that you don't even have to, as a business, pay your way because capital gain over the period of time is simply going to provide enormous wealth, And so some of the issues that we face, I think, are around our very inequitable taxation system, which taxes consumption and income and salary, wages and salary, but doesn't kind of deal to the fact that kind of if you have wealth, then you can very easily kind of multiply that many times over. So there are some really complex kind of issues here. And another factor that I think is into the equation is the fact that we also in the last 30 or 40 years bought into the belief that if we opened the borders and just allowed, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to come into New Zealand, that somehow our GDP would kind of grow and we would become a more wealthy kind of nation or whatever. But without any thought to the fact that if you have a net immigration, then you've got to provide increased housing and infrastructure. And so we've done ourselves, I think, a really gross disservice. Really.
So you're picking up there on the dire failure, therefore, as our immigration numbers have gone up, that we haven't built sufficient houses to meet that need.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's I know we're moving kind of into the political kind of debate here, and I know that there's various kind of opinions around that. But, the level of lack of supply, I don't know what it's like in your suburb, but in Naenae, I know it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous, And at least some of that. In Wellington region, I understand between 2013 and 2018, we had an increase in population of 50,000 people. So where have we put those people? What have we offered in terms of housing and infrastructure? It's those kind of issues that I think have really aggravated the complete imbalance between supply and demand.
I think if I can jump in, I think another trend is, as well as the declining home ownership, has been a real reluctance, or governments being really slow to the party to pick up renters' rights and the importance of that, when we saw there's a growing share of the population are renting and will never own now. And there's still this sort of lagging idea that that's a phase for students that you then move through into home ownership, and that's simply no longer the case. So only last week, under urgency, did the government pass a significant amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act, which is the main law, main legislation governing relations between landlords and tenants, and that's been around since I think the 70s. So very outdated legislation. And has only sort of had band-aid fixes, and even this most recent one doesn't significantly shift the power imbalance which exists. I do work at Anglican Advocacy, but my one of the hobbies on the side I do is with a group called Renters United, and we did some surveying of renters a couple of years ago and heard their stories about renting. And one of the themes that came through is that renters feel like second-class citizens, and it's people. It's the feeling that you can't put down roots, and that actually if anything goes wrong in your situation, you don't actually have the power to challenge that because you can just be moved on. And so those kind of security things that in other countries renting can be just fine. If it's very secure, if the quality of the housing is good, renting's not a problem. If people choose to rent, that's their choice. But in New Zealand, the feeling is that it's that second-class citizen kind of feeling, huge transients, kids moving schools. I think the average length of a tenancy is about 2 years. So that affects everyone. Why is it a big deal? It's a huge deal for all of us if that's happening in our communities. But if the government's only playing catch up now, and like these guys were saying, those who have property they are significantly more politically powerful as a group. Most politicians own at least one home. So when you're talking about the political power of renters to challenge this power imbalance and to argue for their rights, compared to, you start to understand why we don't have a capital gains tax and why it's taken 30 years to reform the Residential Tenancies Act even as much as it did last week. I think those are some contributors.
So there's a sense in which the picture you're painting here is a sense of dissonance, because we still tell ourselves this dream that the Kiwi dream is that we will all own a home, and we've had this shift over the last 30 years, so we still tell that, but actually the reality is quite radically different, and then our policy is still set to the dream-like illusion now, which is that we'll all end up being homeowners of some version.
To crystallise this, so one of the changes that the government made last week was that tenants are now allowed to put pictures on the wall and landlords cannot refuse. They can also secure their bookcases to the wall in case for earthquake proofing, and they can put child safety gates in, and the landlord's not allowed to say no. So those are some pretty basic steps that a person might wish to take to make their house their home. Forget about things like painting or redecorating. You know, these are pretty basic things, and we've just got to the, well, we haven't even got to the point, it hasn't come into force for 6 more months. So you can almost, renters can almost put their pictures on the wall. Yeah.
I mean, part of it, Andrew, comes down, doesn't it, to your vision of what a flourishing society would look like, you know, and I think in terms of, certainly in terms of, to me, a biblical Christian perspective, it's not one that kind of necessarily promotes home ownership as against kind of, you know, tenanting a place, but it is one that, that promotes a place of security and solidity where, you know, where flourishing and community and relationships and, you know, all that sort of stuff can really kind of take part, you know. And yeah, the renting situation, as has been explained, deeply destabilises the potential for that.
Can you unpack what that actually means when we talk about destabilising, and say the distinction between having a house and creating home?
Well, here's 2 or 3 other examples in our neighbourhood with people that we know. So when house prices really started to take off in Naenae about 4 or 5 years ago, increasingly landlords who'd been in the game for a while wanted to kind of offload their properties, quite a stack. In fact, I had a real estate agent come to me who sold a lot of places in the area and said, I have this landlord that has a number of properties in Naenae and he wants to kind of take his money and run. Now, we found out about a number of these families that were renting these properties, and often they had been there for 8 or 10 years. Their children were at local primary schools. They didn't want to move, but suddenly they find themselves where they're getting notice, essentially, because, you know, they don't know who's going to be buying their property. One of the beautiful kind of things in our community was that we found out about 2 or 3 of these situations, and we had folk within our church who were able to buy the property and keep the tenants in, or in one case move the family to another place that they'd bought just down the road, you know, in order to house kind of families, you know. But that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So that insecurity, the sense that you know, I think the dream is that all of us should be able to put down our roots and build kind of, you know, a future for ourselves in a local community, in a neighbourhood. And if that's always at risk, you know, then there becomes this deep disparity between those who have their own home and so therefore, short of a major disaster, are going to be able to kind of stay and build a future in that place, and those that are kind of thinking from week to week, am I really going to be here in another 12 months' time?
The City Council, one of the community engagement people came in, contacted Renters United, and they said, we hear from residents associations all the time, we never hear from renters. Can you tell us how to hear from renters? So in terms of just something like local democracy, it's homeowners with a stake in the neighbourhood. You know, why would you bother if you're not, you know, if you're only in the suburb for a couple of years? Yeah, and I mean, are renters even voting? Because I don't know if you've lived in a rental place, how much mail you're getting at the moment about the election that's not getting to your former flatmates. Yeah.
And so therefore you begin to see how that plays itself out in terms of social cohesion, education, in terms of stability at school, both for kids, but also for the school itself. In terms of democracy, in terms of the input of government and the interest in that area. So it begins to then filter its way through the whole in terms of New Zealand society.
That's right.
And I think there are examples in like democracies that are really quite different. I mean, if you take Scandinavia, Holland, Germany, renting is as good as home owning. It's a genuine choice because housing security is preserved. So in most of these countries, if you rent a house, there's limits onto how much rent can rise, but there's only 3 things that you can be kicked out for. A landlord can only get rid of you if you trash the house, don't pay the rent, or if the landlord, that person themselves, moves into the house, not one of their family, but themselves, moves into that house, in other words, frees up another house wherever they're living. And basically in those countries, if you sell a house and that you've got tenants in, the person buying the house takes the tenants and lives with those laws. Now these are modern people that say you can't do this in the market. Well, they're doing it in countries that have got much better markets than we've got, much more productive economies than we've got. So to pick up your point, I mean, it was a tragedy when Jacinda, who's done so many things well, committed not to have a capital gains tax, not just for this term, because Peter stopped it, but for the whole of her time as Prime Minister, which could be a very long time, given her age and her ability. So, I mean, she's done some wonderful things, and in the social, in all sorts of areas, in the social area too. But it was a tragedy, actually, in terms of housing. There's ways they can get around it. They can develop a tax that would get at the wealth in some other way. But it's very sad that's happened. The other thing that I think is structural in all of this is it's not just housing supply. Housing supply is short. But the other thing that occurred over the 90s was that prior to the 90s, they were building about 35% of houses in what they call the lower quartile of value. That is, people who are in the bottom quartile of incomes. So the bottom 25% of incomes. There were houses, about 35% of the builds were for that group, so they were like 1 bathroom and toilet, 2 or 3 bedrooms, minimal houses, but people of my generation, we all grew up in those sort of houses, in the 50s and 60s.
It was called the state house.
Yeah. Well, not just state houses, but the private houses were built the same. And now, where it was 35%, now we build only 8% in that lower quartile. So even with houses available, 40% are being built in the top quartile, because it's much more profitable for builders to have these 3 bathroom, 5 bedroom, mansions. And it keeps them in work for longer, they get more profit from it. And when you don't control the market, that sort of thing happens. So that's going on at the same time, which is affecting the whole supply.
Which again is interesting in light of some of the other challenges we face regarding a flourishing future. Yes, the one next one.
That's me.
In terms of flourishing future, because so the average house size in New Zealand now is 200 square metres, 220 square metres for a house, and so we've then got to heat those things and have more land, etc. And so that exacerbates our questions here around sustainability in terms of the sheer amount of material going into there. But you're also saying it reinforces this affordability issue because actually there's only 8% being built for the people who actually the other.
Well, I also think that having experience in terms of the community housing kind of field, that the urban design rules for most councils favour more expensive housing, and so the kind of, I'm not talking here about kind of good quality housing, I'm talking about housing that might be aesthetically much more pleasing than something that's kind of more kind of standard, but every bend or corner that you put in the house costs you money, for instance, every different roof line costs you money. And most councils, I think, are fairly immovable in terms of those things. So the challenge for people in the sphere of kind of building housing for those that would make it affordable is immense, really. You've got some significant barriers there to actually build really good quality housing but at a reasonable price, so that it becomes affordable. Obviously, you've got the land cost on top of that, which is a significant factor in the equation as well. So the hoops that you have to go through, I think, are significant.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that question because of your experience being a property developer now. But one of the things we talked about homeowners and renting. I guess my other question then is, Danielle, around experiences of those who actually then social housing end of the spectrum, which is actually they don't rent and they certainly don't own, and actually then how those people cope in New Zealand society, and recognising particularly that you've thought a lot about this and then engaged with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that reality of the housing crisis?
Sure, yeah. I think so. If you're not owning a house and you don't have the income or the capacity to even rent because rents are skyrocketing, obviously it leaves you in a pretty shit space to make a home actually, and so you kind of bouncing from place to place, maybe you're couch surfing, and I think the impact on the psychology of it's like if they can't put down those roots, it affects everything. So talk about education, but also affects friendships and any kind of sense of stability, and of course that leads into kind of like mental health and all sorts of other issues. And so I think it kind of just gets harder and harder then to find your place. And I guess it's where you see people on the streets, or backpackers, and they're not able to kind of keep up paying for that. And so at Berrigan House down the road, we do, people come to us, but they've literally got nowhere else to go sometimes, and and it's amazing to offer that space, but we don't have enough spaces like that, and I think it's very noticeable when you walk down the streets and you see people on the sidewalk, and
And then the people who are coming to Berrigan House in that sense as well, that's not going to be their long-term home, I'm presuming. There's often it's more a case of emergency situations, or some of them that's going to become their permanent.
It kind of varies. All of us living there don't actually know how long we'll be there for, but obviously the Catholic Church and they very generously allowed us to live there for the time being. And some of us, it's not too much of a worry because we know we have other places we can go. We have family with houses or with land, or places we can set up and we can get jobs to rent. But for a lot of people, it's kind of emergency short-term stuff that we can offer. And sometimes someone comes for a week and stays for a couple of years, but it is kind of at that end, just kind of more emergency. People in real need.
Well, wondering here actually just to talk about the state of New Zealand housing in terms of, so picking up on your comment here, Wayne, around the nature of moving to a more aesthetic house and which are more expensive. And one of the questions I have is around the quality of New Zealand houses, and particularly our rental houses. Why have we got such poor housing stock? What's created that situation in New Zealand?
By the way, I'm not against aesthetics, so even though my fashion is very poor, I know. I think historically, commentators would say that we've been lulled into a false sense of temperate climate, kind of, and so if you've lived in the northern hemisphere, you will know that houses have to be built in order to kind of get through a winter. Here, we have seriously underestimated kind of the dampness of our climate, and haven't really appreciated kind of how houses should be ventilated, how they can become healthy, really, into how they can be built healthy and then stay healthy, I guess. And so we're really kind of Johnny-come-latelys in terms of understanding something of this. And even today, our building code is not really up to scratch. It's a lot better than it was 30 years ago, but there's still some distance to go on that.
A few years ago, I wandered along, I was on a walking track and I bumped into a Slovenian architect. I didn't know that's what she was, and she was in Christchurch and she was working on sustainable housing, and I said, that must be a really exciting area to work in post-earthquake. And she looked at me, rolled her eyes, and she said, She said, I can't believe it. It's like I'm in a third world country. She said, you have no idea what sustainability is in the country. And proceeded to tell me about, triple glazing, PVC broken, etc., and explained that this was standard practice and that you've only just got round to having double glazing in your house. What are you thinking? And was living in a poor quality house in Christchurch where she was experiencing that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this goes hand in hand with the affordability, the barriers to home ownership. Numerous studies have shown that rental housing is in poorer condition than owner occupied, which kind of makes sense. If you think about it. But as well with the less political power of people who rent, our standards have been slow to increase. And so there's been a campaign, I think, by the leading researchers on healthy homes are Otago Public Health researchers, and they've been campaigning. I think it's pushing, you reckon it was about early 2000s, they started pushing for a warrant of fitness on rental housing, basically saying there needs to be a standard below which you can't rent a place out. It's dangerous, people will get sick and they'll die. And they've been pushing for that since then, with numerous studies backing up the links between poor housing and poor health. And there's just been a huge reluctance from the government standards have lifted, and they've lifted gradually, but there hasn't been a warrant of fitness style enforcement regime brought in. In my personal view, my view is that it is just the result of the lack of power that renters have, because there's been a consistent narrative that it's too expensive for property owners to pay the little bit of money for someone else to come and inspect a place. Most houses are probably fine, so why would we impose that cost of a couple of $100 on the landlords to get that checked? That's too costly, so we're not gonna do that. The result is that we've got healthy home standards which lift the bar, but the onus remains on tenants to enforce those standards. So you need to know what's going on in your ceiling in terms of insulation. You need to physically be able to get up there and check. You need to know what the rules are, whether your house meets the exemptions, all this stuff, and then you need to have the gumption to go to the tenancy tribunal if it doesn't meet the standards. So unless that changes, I don't think we're going to see a significant improvement in the quality, because tenants don't go to the tribunal. 9 out of 10 cases brought to the tribunal are brought by landlords. Numerous barriers exist.
And that not bringing it to tribunal is essentially because the power asymmetry that's in that relationship.
A number of reasons. Tenants don't know how to go to the tribunal. The rewards are too low to make it worth their while. It's a very lengthy process, and you don't know if you're going to win. There's also a publicly searchable database by people's names. So any person who goes to the tribunal will have their name public for 3 years, and there are also private companies who mine that data and then use it to screen prospective tenants. And basically blacklist those who have kicked up a fuss in the past. And so tenants know about this, and consequently are very reluctant to kick up a fuss.
This is why, it just, to say that renting's acceptable in New Zealand it's just ridiculous for all these reasons. We've developed a process where we're one of the only countries that doesn't have a capital gains tax. I mean, even Australia has a capital gains tax.
Even Australia?
It had the same model of housing as we had, yeah. They have a capital gains tax. And so what happens is that many people buy a house or another house for their retirement because it's the best way to build funds. And that's fine if they look after it and they charge reasonable rents if they're good landlords. But so often people use it just to squeeze as much profit out of it as possible. So I think there's a number of solutions we have to look to. One is that the players in the market at the moment, at the one end, you've got state houses, then you've got the private landlords, and then you've got the developers. What we need is a third sector in there, the not-for-profit developers. Now in the UK, for example, 18% of housing is in this third sector. the old housing associations that were built up originally in Victoriana. And since then, local council housing, all sorts of other types of housing. And in everywhere else in the rest of the world, social housing refers to both renting and ownership. And these groups provide competition for the developers. They become developers themselves. Now, we've got groups like this in New Zealand already, but they're very small because they're not given the contracts. And we're at an absolutely crucial phase now in New Zealand from a policy point of view of whether Megan Woods and Grant Robertson are going to open up these contracts. And they've made a tentative move in this direction, which is good. So there's the New Zealand Housing Foundation, for example, Tyndall, from the warehouse, funded it originally. They are not-for-profit developers. You might be aware of Char Community Housing Aotearoa. They're part of a whole collective of these sort of groups. Now, the New Zealand Housing Foundation is in about two in Auckland and one development in Christchurch, built 200 houses at a time. So these are developments of 200. They're capable of building 1,000. And if they got the contracts to build 1,000, they become capable of building 5,000. All the profits go back into housing. They pay good salaries for all the people that work in them, but the profits go back into housing. And they provide pastoral support for people paying their mortgages so they don't get into mortgage trouble. If they lose a job or something, they find ways to help them through that period. Those that are renting are in much more secure rental. And they're doing rent-to-buy schemes. A portion of your rent goes towards your equity. They're doing shared equity schemes so you can afford a mortgage for, say, 70% of the house, but you can't afford it for the whole house. So they keep the value of 30% of the house. And when it's sold, you all share the equity that's been gained, 70 to 30, these sorts of things. So I think there's a whole lot of solutions that need to come into this discussion, and the government is on the edge of really beginning to look at it for the first time, and they are beginning to fund some of these, but it's a very small group, and that's what we really need to expand, in my view.
So in that sense, though, that sector then, that becomes, you could say that non-profit sector then begins to take on the role that used to be held by the state.
Yeah.
So the wraparound in terms of state housing that. So as the state has pulled back, one could push back and argue that this is then the logical consequence of neoliberal economic theory, which is the state contracts and then forces others to come and fill in that vacuum.
Well, yeah, except that didn't happen under the neoliberal experiment. It would have to be an intervention by government for that to happen. But the model you've just given is exactly the British model. Right. The British model doesn't build state houses like we do in New Zealand. They simply fund all these housing associations and local councils, not-for-profit developers. And some of these housing associations are bigger than the whole of Housing New Zealand Corporation. They're huge. And some of them are really expert. They've got brilliant designers, they've got all sorts of groups of people. And we're just not smart. We're not... These are countries that we compare ourselves to, and we're not using these models.
So, and my question there, is it smartness, or is it again, is it a sense of that narrative and that imagination? Because we've told ourselves this narrative for so long that to actually imagine a different flourishing future actually takes a big step for us to conceive of it differently.
I'm talking too much, but let me just say one more thing. I'll shut up over that. I think when you talk about a narrative, we want to think of our language. We've moved from the term home to housing product.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. That market move took us into a narrative about housing products. So housing products you make money off and they're all in the market. Home talks about the sort of things that you've all been talking about, security and the place where you relax, a place where you're informal, a place where intimacy is protected, where children are brought up, where stability occurs. And that needs to become the policy focus. We need homes for people to bring up children. That'll make us smarter. you know, people's brain development will, you know, as they grow, will be so much better. Be so much better for the productivity of the country in the end. But it'll just be a so much better quality of life.
Right, and so underneath that, what you're suggesting there is a sense in which neoliberalism is not just an economic system, but has also then robbed us of language and a narrative. So we've become utilitarian in terms of our way of understanding houses as products rather than places of deep belonging, deep home, connection, relationship, community, which historically is the story of what it means to be human, to live well with others. Wayne, could you maybe pick up on, I mean, obviously on a smaller scale, a non-profit
very small scale.
sector here. So a while ago until you get 5,000 houses built. Tell us a little bit about your experiment in Naenae.
Well, we kind of stumbled into it really because we were involved as a little community in helping guys from prison reintegrate. And so we had guys live with us and with our friends kind of next door. But increasingly, as they needed to kind of stretch out, couldn't get rentals. And so in the end, we built 2 units on our church property next door, a 2-bedroom and a 1-bedroom, as kind of an initial kind of way forward, I guess.
Right, and that's a deliberate choice to go for that. We were talking about the 8%. Therefore, to go for houses.
Absolutely, that's right. So built cheaply. Actually employed some of the guys to work with my friend who was the builder. I project managed it. You know, it was free land, of course, because you know it was owned by the church. And then what we'd noticed was that Housing New Zealand had knocked down huge and sold off kind of significant numbers of houses around Naenae. In fact, the houses that ourselves and our friends at Robinson built on, or the land, we bought from Housing New Zealand, you know. There was this big block of land right opposite us that was vacant, and so as the housing crisis kind of deepened in our neighbourhood friends, we realised what was kind of happening. We decided as a church to camp on the land. This was about 3.5 years ago, and not realising really it wasn't a protest against Housing New Zealand primarily. There was a sense of kind of standing in solidarity and raising the profile of the issue. We had no idea.
Like the candle in that sense of
absolutely, exactly. You know. Anyway, it was a few months before the election, and things kind of really hit the fan. And within an hour of the police sergeant kind of ringing Housing New Zealand and saying, you do realise that there's some people camping on your land, we got a call from Housing New Zealand saying we need to have a meeting with you guys, you know. And of course they were a little bit angry, they were careful with their words. But really but I think the fact that we had a little bit of skin in the game meant that we had a little bit of credibility, you know. And that's really, I was going to talk about partnership with government here, because I mean, without overstating it, we've seen a beautiful thing happen in our relationship with Koinonia. So in next Monday, 21 bedroom units are opening kind of on that block of land. And just round the corner, we've already had 12 one-bedroom units, and there's probably about 60 houses altogether in those 2 blocks of land that are. And Koinonia have come to us and said, we realise that we need you guys. You're part of the community. You want to welcome people into the neighbourhood. We need pastoral care for our new tenants. In fact, do you have people that you know that are on the housing register that might be eligible to kind of live in the units? It's been this kind of really lovely thing kind of develop, relational thing, rather than being adversarial, kind of saying how can we work together to really, because they realise that people don't just need houses, as you say, they need homes, and homes mean communities and relationships, all the sort of stuff that, you know, even people short term into Berrigan House are kind of needing as well. About 3 years ago, the church next door to our church decided they would kind of sell their building. And I didn't really kind of want another building project, but kind of felt a gentle kind of tug. And I had this catchphrase that came into my mind, Wayne, Naenae needs more houses, not more churches, or not more church buildings, should I say. And so we worked out a way of kind of buying the property, bowling the asbestos-ridden building, and then building 5 units under a community housing trust, really. Just a small community housing trust. That's kind of semi-connected to the Anglican Church, but it stands apart as well. And then renting those units out to people, many of them in pretty desperate situations, really. And I've seen firsthand there that absolute transformation that our home can make for people in their health, you know, in finding employment, in finding relationship and community and meaning and purpose, stability, all that sort of stuff. There's some beautiful kind of stories that have come out of that, you know. But I realise we're just kind of small-time operators. But I do want to challenge us as the Christian community to say, actually, God has gifted us with creativity and innovation. And, you know, let's not just talk about the problems there, but say, God, how do you want to use us as little clumps, little faith communities to chip away at this and to make, because there's a 1,000 different, you know, solutions. Kate, you know, 3 years ago we had, before the election, had this little kind of thing, 1,000 responses to the housing crisis, eh? And there's lots of different ways that I think that God might be inviting us to kind of, in our own way, be able to respond to the housing crisis.
And that's a nice segue, therefore, to open up, therefore, to talk about those responses. So we've talked about some of the macro realities. There's a, you know, I'm looking around the room here, there's a bunch of university students or recent graduates who are probably thinking, well, I'm never going to get my foot on a ladder, I'm going to rent through some of my life. And then, no disrespect because I've got grey hair as well, there's a few grey-haired people who are obviously at the other end of sort of thinking through questions of life. For those who come from the faith tradition, what are those 1,000 responses? What are the different ways in which, both as individuals but also as communities, we could explore creative ways of responding? Danielle?
Yeah, I love what you're saying about this kind of, I think, finding that creativity, because there are so many different ways of doing this, and I've been reading a little bit around housing, not an expert, but you know, like around housing cooperatives or collective housing, where people, the community is involved in designing the housing, and that meets the needs of the community, therefore. So if it's families and they're living alongside, you know, people who are retired, and actually, yeah, I think it's finding ways that people can design their own homes, and that comes with shared space, and it comes with kind of all those creative approaches, which I think has been kind of killed by the neoliberal kind of agenda, really, because instead of looking at things collectively as a community, we kind of force to take care of ourselves, and when we fail to do that, there's no one there to help us out, really. And so I think that is a very Christian response as well, that is needed. So I think as Christians we do have those values actually that we need to be seeing rolled out across New Zealand, into the economy, into housing. A collective, caring, creative response to these issues, I think are inherent to our faith as well. So I think it's quite an exciting conversation.
Okay, 999 to go.
There's so many cool things. Just like one that comes to mind is landlords who really see that role as
a vocation.
A vocation, and Wayne is a landlord like this, but who, you know, being a landlord is an opportunity to set rent, not only affordable but potentially related to someone's income. To provide secure tenure, to provide really good quality place that's flexible and sees a person as a holistic human being. So that can be definitely a way that God uses people. Another one which is really quite challenging is that a lot of us have spare rooms. And actually, I'm quite interested in Danielle's view on this. But you know, if we have a spare room, I mean, it's not for everyone, but I mean, what would you say to that, Danielle? If you're saying there's not enough places that take in folks who are needing somewhere, what would you say if people are interested in getting into that
Yeah, I think it can be incredibly transformative on a personal level, and I think, I think if you're able to if you have the luxury to be able to open your home to others who are in need, you learn so much, I guess, about the things that our society needs, because you're having to respond to that on a very personal basis, whether it's sharing food or like negotiating tricky circumstances, or like conflict comes up, and you actually have to deal with these questions on a really, really personal level, and be challenged every day. So at Berrigan House we do have a couple of spare rooms where people come short term, maybe they'll stay longer. And I think the change it's made in me over the last couple of years has kind of made me more aware of the kind of creative ways we could be doing life on a larger scale. So I really like the idea that I'm able to, in some ways, live what I want the future to look like. I can make a start now with myself by sharing what I have on a smaller level, and kind of transferring those values through kind of activism, through talks like this, and through kind of collective organising to bring that. So it's not just in the home; it's the neighbourhood, and we're sharing with our neighbours, and we're looking out for the new people who come in. And I think when you can do that in your own home, you're constantly faced with those problems, and so you have to be thinking about it, which is really valuable.
I'm with you on that, Danielle. I kind of think that the prevailing narrative that we have with our homes and houses in New Zealand and within the Christian community, is one of a retreat from the world. And there's a place for that, there's a role for that, But I also think that kind of the biblical dream is for our homes to be a place of hospitality and of engagement and community, And so even in terms of the way that we structure our houses, the way that we build them and structure them, there's a place for different parts of the house being more retreatable and others being more engageable, particularly in bigger houses, And so I think this affects kind of the way that potentially we might design our houses.
And I presume that impacted the way you designed your units in terms of...
Well, it impacted the way that we designed our own house for a start, yeah. So our living areas were large and our bedrooms were small. And our bedrooms were flexible so that they could change in the way that they kind of, use space or whatever. But I also want to just raise the concept again, which I think you alluded to, or someone alluded to, of co-housing and cooperative housing. I'm just, at the moment, project managing for my daughter and her friends in Taita, a little co-op or co-housing kind of development, really. And there are 3 households that basically have lived together in a big house for many years, but now they have children amongst them, and so this is very kind of on top of my kind of mind at the moment, because we've had to carefully think about the way that we structure and design and build. The benefits cost-wise are enormous, because you split the costs. If you're prepared to kind of think communally a little bit more, even in terms of owning your own home, then it becomes much more resourceful.
And I presume it's more sustainable as well.
Much more sustainable. That's exactly right. So I think we really, in terms of our commitment to creation, care, and resourcefulness in the Christian community, these are the sort of things that we need to pay a bit of attention to and really invest in. How can we build in a way that is sustainable, relationally, environmentally, fiscally, all of those factors, and in a way that enables us to have spaces where we can retreat and feel secure and safe, and other spaces that we engage in mission kind of to our neighbourhoods and our communities.
I think the Naenae experiment is a really brilliant example of theology, if you want to sort of address that aspect too. Because I think, generally speaking, our suburban churches have just completely lost their way. They've become sort of cultic centres of peacefulness, and they don't serve communities around them very often. So, some do, of course there are exceptions. But generally speaking, They're not even looking to the communities around them. That church, and it was a pretty small church at the time, you know, looked at the fact that Rimatuka prison was up the road. They started looking after people from there. That led to the housing, as I understand it, the need for housing. They had a big vision. They thought about the assets they had. They were thinking very much about stability that people needed. What you haven't said that I know has also happened is the Diocese has also started to work out ways in which it can contribute. So you get dioceses that have trusts that are getting income from various shareholdings, which pay for all sorts of things. They can actually get a very similar amount by doing a social project and still having a return on the investment, which they need to sustain the ministries that the trusts are currently sustaining. And so the whole thing can build. At the moment, I'm involved with all the churches, Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, Salvation Army, who are looking at all their trusts throughout the country, across the denominations, and ways in which they can use this asset base to still gain a profit, but actually be able to serve a social purpose in housing. That the churches are really beginning to think of it, and it's experiments like this, and also a lot of push from groups like the New Zealand Housing Foundation and others of us that are trying to alert them how serious the housing crisis is. So there is so much opportunity in parishes or in small groups in communities and suburbs to do, but we've actually got to get our vision out. You know, these sort of things we're talking about tonight need to be part of conversations that so often just never go on in these places. And it's tragic, it's really tragic. Yeah.
Can I just ask if anyone has equity, just to consider using that. What Wayne was talking about with co-buying models. My husband and I, another couple and a third couple went together and bought a house, a 6-bedroom house, and 9 of us live in it. And the two of the couples were first time home buyers. The third couple was from a generation above us and had some money that they wanted to put into some form of investment. And without their input, we couldn't have got the deposit. But with the deposit, we can, our income's sufficient to pay the mortgage. So just getting that across that hurdle, that was a huge benefit. There's been some really interesting outfits pop up as well. There's one in Christchurch where Christians are pooling their equity together, maybe $10,000 that you can borrow extra from the bank, and putting that together to help people get the deposit to get into a home, and then even taking the equity out later to do it again and again. So it's a resource that people are sitting on.
And Kate's husband's a lawyer, so that they can work. Well, it's really helpful because you can think you're tied into this for the rest of your life. Yeah. You can work these things out so that if one group wants to leave, how the arrangements are, how you are able to take your part of the equity out and get those agreements right from the beginning. So you need good legal support, and I think I'm sure that's part of what you're talking about in terms of project management. Also,
these are some really creative solutions, I think, to the problem, but it kind of raises a question for me around not everyone has access to even that much money, and actually when we're talking about land and ownership, a lot of Māori who originally owned everything don't have access to the kind of money to even make a start there, and so I guess I'm kind of interested in the conversation about widening it to the economy and how we structure the economy, and why is it that there are people who have absolutely nothing and others who have multiple houses, and within our Christianity, where is the place for actually just giving without any expectation of profit or anything in return? And yes, I think that's kind of another kind of wider question for this conversation, one that I don't have the answers for, but I'd be interested to hear how you guys might have engaged in some of these questions.
can I suggest actually that we hold that for another night, just because it opens up a whole,
Sure,
you know, a whole macro question in terms of at a much bigger level. And I'm aware of time. The way I would like to end is your final reflections, particularly for younger people here. What does a flourishing future looks like? I mean, it sounds to me like you've begun to map out a potential around co-housing and which is both, if you're going to use Christian phrases, missional in terms of providing a place of deep relationship, deep belonging, a shared community, which is outward looking, which is grounded in a place which has space open for others to join. What would you say to the younger generation here?
I'd say that there's much more hope than pessimism in me, despite kind of, you know, some of the huge challenges that we're facing. You know, there's a period for, particularly if you're a student, where your roots are probably not well, you know, going down too far because you're still kind of in transition. But when you kind of move to a stage where you know, you're looking for more long-term stability, find a faith community and an area where you feel God is, you know, inviting you to engage and to participate in, and put your roots down, you know, in that community, and find others around you who you can dream with and who you can journey with. There are faith communities around like that, and people, I mean, you know, I know there's enormous challenges, but, and, you know, my generation, we've done a pretty stumbling kind of job of kind of this whole thing, but I have real hope that younger generations will really kind of pick this up and be more committed to as I say, a sustainable future, and one that kind of has community and relationship and mission at the heart of it, rather than just kind of pursuing the great Kiwi dream, which, you know, is pretty limited.
I think, like, big picture, I think we have to sort out the unjust, inequitable distribution of wealth in New Zealand. It's not okay, like, and it's not okay the ethnic, that 2/3 of Pacifica are renting and that only 1/5 of New Zealand Europeans. You know, those inequalities are not acceptable, and to challenge them requires some real restructuring of the way we run our economy, and it will require the building of political power among people who are not property owners. Yes. If you're interested, tomorrow...
We'll throw it up.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. So Renters United, one of the things we're doing is challenging the runaway rents in comparison with just the fact rents are outstripping wages. And so we're putting, tomorrow lunchtime in Civic Square, we're putting to the political parties the question of runaway rents and asking what their solutions are going to be. So if that's something that interests you, 12:15 till 1:30, Civic Square tomorrow, a rally for fair rents. Yeah, it'd be really great to have a good crowd to, put pressure on politicians to, address it as a priority.
Danielle and Charles.
I think it's really important not to lose hope. Equity is about income equity and asset equity, and it's really important to keep those two things together. And it's your right to have housing security. So fight for that right. And there is a lot of work being done on this at the moment, and there is change occurring in this area. So I think in terms of people thinking of their own lives, they need to find ways in which they're not just giving all their money out to a landlord. Like, make it work for you. Find a way to get some equity in it, get some arrangement where you can get even a proportion, even 5% of a property to begin with. You know, it can multiply. But the other thing is, is to work for political change, because home ownership was just not even on the political radar for 25 to 30 years that I've been involved in these struggles, but it's really on there now, and a lot of people have worked pretty hard to get it there, and I think this is a time to really push. And they were giving income-related mortgages. That means people on a benefit can get a house. You know, like, we've got to think in those terms and work with them. I think the Greens are onto this more than any other political group at the moment, and the push they made last week around this, I think, is really important. And I think Labour's really open to it, but are cautious, you know, because they're a middle road party, and they've got people on the right they've got to keep on side to stay in power. But don't lose that vision. Don't give it away. You know, like I hear people saying, you know, I don't think I can ever own a house. It's really important to keep that vision yourself and to share it with others.
Danielle.
I guess, just going off that, like, there's so much to be pessimistic about, and there's so much to be worried about, and things look like they're getting worse. And so I think, like, one of the biggest lessons I've learned in recent years is not being afraid to have the goal as utopia. Like, utopia should be the goal. The kingdom of heaven is utopia. We should be actually asking the impossible. And I think when we start dreaming that way and thinking that way, we kind of orient our lives that way. And we can get creative and find other solutions in between the cracks. And I think if you set your goals huge, then it's actually way easier to kind of dream into these things and not get downcast, as it is easy to do at my age.
Awesome, thank you, Danielle.
And this is a great area of study if you're studying economics or sociology or whatever, you know?
And in doing so, the church got a new building, the families got housing, the local school was able to stay open, they were under budget and almost carbon neutral. And it's just like a little example, but it's so positive. And I just found out about it because I was visiting my mum's friend who lived in that neighbourhood, and on our walk she was like, "Oh, did you see that building? This is something we all got together behind as a community." So I just keep sharing that story with people, like we see in Naenae, it is possible.
Part of the plan for these flourishing conversations is to open conversation up, and so unfortunately I'm going to close it down now because of time, and so you're probably thinking, oh, but I've got a million questions that I really want to fire, and what we're going to do is actually have a break, and we're going to finish and have something to eat and drink, and that then gives you opportunity to continue that conversation with each other, or to collar one of these guys and say, tell me about the Naenae, or to say, I completely, utterly disagree with you. And part of good civil discourse is recognising actually that there are no wrong or right answers, particularly on these issues in terms of how complex they are. And so actually you can disagree and push back and ask for greater nuance or greater understanding about how that works. I want to say thanks to the four of you for coming and sitting in hot seats and offering a whole lot of your wisdom, experience, background, and also passion on these areas. We have a wee gift for you, which Mel's going to find. And thanks for coming along and being part of the conversation. And I do encourage you to stay. There are hot drinks and some snacks.
Andrew, did you want to talk about the following conversation?
I'll do this in a second. So we'll hand out, and maybe if we can give these guys a round of applause. So two final things here. One is plugging, go back, thanks, Matt. This is plugging Kate's event tomorrow, so Renters Unite. So that's tomorrow down in Civic Square. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll be back here again, and the conversation is with students, citizens and surveillance, technology, theology, and the future of education and democracy. We're going to have a conversation around Facebook and Google and the world that we live in. And next week. Sorry, that's in 2 weeks' time. I think there's one more slide. Is there one more slide there as well? And then, again, this is for Kate and the Anglican movement. There's a bunch of organisations there, Action Station, Anglican movement, Poverty Action Group. They've got an election forum at St. Peter's, where Charles is one of the co-vicars, and that's 2 weeks' time on Wednesday. So if you want to be part of the conversation, I presume you've got candidates who will be part of that. Yep. So if you want to go along and be part of that discussion with politicians and raising some of those questions around housing and the other issues that we're dealing with as we approach election, then encourage you to participate in that as well. Thank you again for coming. Enjoy the chance to continue chewing the fat and having a couple with each other. Cheers.